Okay. Okay.
Okay, so now let's our final topic for the day is evolution of the trait mean on a surface. And the surface that's relevant then is this adaptive landscape. I keep showing you this silly cartoon, but this is the axis, this is the plot of mean fitness or natural log mean fitness as a function of the trait values. I always show two traits just because it's easier to look at, but it could be multi-axis. And again, it's not a metaphor because we have equations for how this happens. Okay, so here's our thesis, and that is that models for adaptive radiation or macroevolutionary process, whatever you want to call it, can be constructed with quantitative genetic parameters. And why would we want to do that? We can use these quantitative parameters to cross-check with the empirical literature on inheritance, selection, and population size. That can tell us whether the parameters of our Gaussian distribution, of our Brownian motion process, or our Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process are within the realm, within the bounds of empirical reality. And then lastly, stabilizing selection and peak movement appear to be necessary, but not sufficient to account for evolution in deep time. I'm less cautious about that now than I was when I wrote this, but in any case. Okay, first of all, let's begin with a first model of evolution, and we won't have any adaptive landscape at all. We're going to have Brownian motion of the trait, and this is going to be genetic drift of the trait mean. So this is the first kind of Brownian motion model that I want to talk about today. And what we're talking about, that if we take a sample of any, let's let the effective population and size of the population be NE. If we sample that many of individuals from a normal distribution of breeding values, then the variance of that sample will be 1 over n sub e times g, that sample of n sub e individuals. So you can see n sub e is in the denominator. So that if n sub e is small, there's a lot of variance between these replicate lineages that are undergoing the sampling process. In fact, if we sample, and here's an example of an individual lineage evolving by this rule, and there's just sampling variance each generation, and that's all that is. Well, I'll show you the model for it in a minute. If we project this variance into the future, so that we can model a whole set of replicate populations, then we'll get a picture that looks like this. Here I've extrapolated 100 lineages, with each with an effective size of 100, and they have the identical genetic parameter of genetic variance set to 0.4. Remember, P, the phenotypic variance within populations, is 1 in here in all the slides that I'm going to be showing from now on. And let's just look at an animation. Now here with fewer replicates, same parameters, but just 25, the red dots just show the last generation. And so you see the population, you see a lot of population differentiation, and quite fast too. But if we ratchet here's a replicate. I guess we have to wait for the, we'll see what happens when you've got a larger n sub e. Maybe we're going to wait forever. I can't remember what we did in this animation now. Well, the point is, different sets of 25 lineages will give you different results, and so they don't all look the same. All right. All right. Now let's consider evolution on a So here's some, let me make a general point about this model. I don't think I do it, I make it in this PowerPoint, but it's amply illustrated in the chapter. The problem with this version of genetic drift is that it produces too little differentiation on a short time scale. I mean, just drift as an explanation for adaptive radiations. If you compare this with actual data, it's producing too little differentiation on short time scales and too much on long time scales. So, I mean, no matter, if you use realistic values for N sub E, there's just nowhere of getting out of this bind. So I can say that, and you can see this backed up in the chapter, that Brownian motion via drift of the trait mean is not going to be a good explanation for adaptive radiations that have been observed. So let's move to adaptive radiations that might be the response to a stationary adaptive peak, the sort of easiest model with a peak. The first thing that we know is that there's a tendency to evolve uphill on the adaptive landscape. Now that's demonstrated by just looking at our standard equation for response to selection and showing that this last term, if we arrange the terms in this equation, is equivalent to saying that the change per generation in the log of mean fitness takes on a value that has to be equal or greater than 0. So you can't evolve downhill on an adaptive peak under the simple model that we're using. Okay, so now let's talk about a single adaptive peak, and this is sometimes known as the Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process. At least in quantitative genetics, we prefer to show the terms of, write down the terms in terms of quantitative genetic parameters. So for example, let's look at the mean in a particular generation, T+1. That mean is based on the mean in the preceding generation, plus a response to selection, which is, you'll recognize this as the beta in a Gaussian adaptive peak model, right? Go back and look. I think I've reversed these so that it should be Z bar anyway. I've got the terms reversed. But at any rate, this is the responsive selection. This is the term that causes the mean to evolve towards the peak. And then we've also got a term of genetic drift. So we're going to add genetic drift to this model so that no matter what size population we're modeling, even in a small one, we'll have a contribution of drift. And we account for that by using the preceding model. This N with parentheses means a draw from a normal distribution with a mean of 0 and a variance per generation of G over N sub E. We took it right from here, right? Well, the per generation term. So with this model, if we start off replicate generations at some low trait value or some arbitrary trait value with a common ancestor, and look at those replicate lineages through time, this is the variance among those replicate lineages and trait means that we expect at generation T. And you can see that it's a function of the width of the adaptive landscape. The weaker the curvature of the adaptive landscape, the more shallow, the larger the variance we'll get at generation T. And the larger the effective population size, the smaller will be the variance we'll see among populations. This term is a vanishing term in which goes to 1 because this part is going to 0 as T goes to infinity, and it represents the transient part of the curve as populations approach the peak. So looking at a graph, we look at a single lineage and plot its mean as a function of time. Here I've set the parameters so that the peak is at 0. The width is 10 times within population phenotypic standard deviation variance, which is P. You said G. Where did we get 0.4? Remember that distribution of genetic heritabilities that I showed you, the standard value being 0.4, 0.5. We've set P equal to 1, so that means G is right there, and we set it in modal value. And you can see that what happens is the trait mean bounces between these are the 95% confidence limits for where the mean should be as a function of time. And you can see this mean, this lineage is bouncing about the adaptive peak. It's being drawn towards the peak by the pull towards the Ornstein-Uhlenbeck pull, and moving away from the peak by drift. And so here we see 25 replicate populations evolving. And if we watch them, you'll see that they quickly achieve a kind of drift selection balance. And they're bouncing within these relatively tight limits, something I'm going to focus on in just a minute. Let's look at a quick animation. There's a single population, single lineage. Here's an ensemble of 25. So here's the point. Let me just, I guess I can't freeze it here, but see, this is very weak selection. And even so, we only got a radiation that was only a half of a phenotypic standard deviation on either side of the optimum. I'll let you look at this later. Wait, what happened here? So the upshot of this model, I thought I had another slide in here, is that playing around with N sub E and the strength of stabilizing selection, the limiting bounds for this adaptive radiation among these reptiles is very confined. I mean, most adaptive radiations of traits that you think are evolving, the variance among all the tips at the end of the tree is a lot more than one phenotypic standard deviation, a total, that is half a standard deviation on the mean. So this model, no matter what you do with the parameters, is not going to account for adaptive radiations that were interesting. It's a great model for stasis. So if you're dealing with traits that are constant over long stretches of evolutionary time with very modest movement, then this could be a decent model. Let's look at the same model with two traits. So it's the same model, but now we've got matrices for omega, P, and see, that's why I'm taking an inverse here. It's easiest to understand what happens in an animation. So let me tell you what we're going to see. What I'm showing here is, here's G, just a standard value for genetic variance. Remember, P is 1. And I'm showing a completely circular G matrix. We're going to look at 1,000 generations. We're going to let N sub E be 100, just so we can see the effects of drift and pulling the lineages away from the mean. And we've got quite weak stabilizing selection and actually quite strong correlational selection. Okay, so we're going to look at this one, and then we're going to look at this one. And what we're going to show in red here, what we're showing here in red is the 95% confidence contours for this for the adaptive landscape selection surface. So oriented, you can see how the matrices are similar. No, I'm not showing, what am I not showing here? I'm not showing, well, you can see that this is in blue, I'm showing you the 95% confidence ellipses for the equilibrated lineage mean. So let me show you this animation, and I think you'll get a sense of what's going on. Now I've changed the color scheme on you here a little bit, but what you're seeing are replicate lineages, one after the other, starting at the origin and then evolving by drift, stabilizing selection balance. And what you can see is even out to 1,000 generations, the populations are staying within these violet bounds that are the 95% confidence limits for the radiation. Now here, unfortunately, the G is in blue. But you notice how it's the shape of the adaptive landscape that's constraining the shape of the radiation, not G. Let's go look at another case. Here we've got both aligned. That is to say, the G matrix and the selection matrix both have correlated selection and genetic correlation. A revealing one is to look at this one. So there's a lot of genetic variation in this direction, and yet the lineages are constrained not by genetic variation. What they show is the effect of the adaptive landscape in constraining the radiation to look just like have the same shape as the adaptive landscape. Let me back out. We can see that easily in the equations. So what happens is, as t goes to infinity, this term goes to 0, becomes 1, and the variance among the populations and the shape in bivariate space is given by the shape of the adaptive landscape. That's what we're showing here in red. Notice that genetic variance, the G matrix, doesn't even come into the configuration except indirectly through P. But that's a much smaller term than omega when selection is weak. Are you with me? So here's the bottom line. I hate this verb, but it's true that the adaptive landscape is trumping the G matrix in specifying the shape and size of the adaptive landscape. It's kind of a disappointment, isn't it? Because we've been wringing our hands about the details of heritability in the G matrix. And here it is, dropping out of the equation for the limiting shape of the adaptive radiation. But in any case, even though we're in 2 dimensions, we're not producing a very extensive adaptive radiation with this model, making N sub E, even making N sub E unrealistically small, which should promote a radiation, taking realistic values for omega, or even large values, small values of E, large values for still large values for the width of the adaptive landscape. Still, we get a very modest adaptive radiation. The heartbreak of OU, to account for data requires a small N sub E or very weak stabilizing selection. And even doing both, you don't get a very big adaptive radiation. You're not going to get birds of paradise or anolis lizards with this model. Now, what is going to generate an adaptive radiation of almost any size that you would like is Brownian motion of a Gaussian adaptive peak. All right, so let's look at our model. One thing that happens is the optimum is undergoing Brownian motion. So this is the adaptive peak. This is only in 1 dimension. We've got a single trait, and here's the equation for the trait each generation. If I left a term out there, it seems like no, I guess I've done it right. It all depends on what yes, okay. So you've got the response to stabilizing selection, drawing the mean towards the peak, and a draw from a normal distribution. This is the effect of drift in moving the population away from the peak. But you can, if you look at with the parameters that I'm showing here, you can see that the trait mean is doing a pretty good job of tracking the mean. I mean, I haven't done it, but if you overlaid the peak with the trait mean with the peak, it would be pretty close. So basically what this trait is, what this model is showing, is that it's all in the behavior of the adaptive peak. The variance among the trait means is a very complicated function, but it boils down to being controlled by the variance in the position of the peak. So remember, let me back up and show you what that is. What happens is each generation, the position of the peak is determined by a draw from a normal distribution, and that normal distribution has a zero mean and a variance that's equal to this term, sigma squared sub theta. And so when you look at replicate populations, they're basically mirroring the pattern through time in the peak. But the point for our purposes is this model does a very good job of accounting for adaptive radiations if you've got a reasonable value for n sub e and for the width of the selection function. But the primary thing is having a realistic value for the rate of peak movement. Here's another model that does a good job, and sometimes a better job than the Brownian motion of the peak that we just talked about. Let's suppose that the trait mean, and we're going to model it just as having a white noise process, so it creates a band of values, but rarely the optimum of the adaptive landscape jumps to a new position and then holds that position indefinitely until another jump event happens. And these jumps or bursts are governed by a Poisson process. So there can be a long waiting time in between these jumps. And we're also, just for simplicity, this is a model with Joseph Wett as the senior author, so he'll talk about this more later. We're assuming that the lineage mean is instantaneously tracking the burst in the optimum and otherwise evolving according to a white noise process. Okay, so you get a model that sweeps along and then bounces outside of the initial limits, jumps outside. So Weta et al., I was one of the co-authors in this 2011 paper, 1911, that would be a trick, 2011 paper. We were trying to fit models to these data, and Joseph again will talk about them later. So let's think about what these data are. This point here is data from the fossil record of a lineage that was differed about, I can't remember what my units are here, but this is equivalent to about 7 phenotypic standard deviations away from the beginning point. So this is quite a lot of divergence in the positive direction over a period of, what is that, about maybe 20 million years, something like that. 7, 10, this would be 10 million. So this is more like 2.5 million years. So each of these points represents the distance between two means, divergence graphed on this axis, as a function of the time separating those two samples of trait means. Most of the data plotted here are body size measurements because that's comparable between all sorts of taxa. There are a lot of taxa sampled here and about 8,000 data points. And the time scale ranges from 1 year out to 10 to the 8th, which would be 10 to the 6 is a million. 10, that's over 100 million. So this would be about 300 million years. These are tree-based data out here in blue. Paleofossil records in green, contemporary records in yellow and light green. Okay, so here's the interesting thing. If you just look at the data, you see that you get divergence that seems to be bounded inside bounds that are about, as I say, plus or minus 6 phenotypic standard deviations. But then on a very long time scale, you can see that you can see many data points that are outside those limits and sometimes quite far outside them. So fitting the model that we just looked at, this multiple jump or burst model, there are a couple of parameters that are set. For one thing, the dash distribution shows the distribution of the white noise variable that counts for those black up and down jogs in the mean. The burst size distribution is shown in a solid, in the solid distribution. So this is a maximum likelihood fit to the data, and these are the maximum likelihood estimates of these parameters. So this is the maximum likelihood characterization of the Gaussian curve that represents the burst size distribution. So you can see it's really, the bursts are not way out here. They're quite modest in size. The standard deviation is only like a couple of phenotypic standard deviations away from this starting point. Now the burst timing distribution, this is the inverse of the gamma parameter in a Poisson distribution. It gives you the waiting time between bursts, and the maximum likely fit to that burst time is 25 million years. So in other words, a model of multiple bursts with that looks like this, with a burst size distribution like this. In other words, when the event happens, you draw a value from this normal distribution of burst sizes, and the timing is a Poisson parameter that gives you an expected time between, mean time between bursts of 25 million years. That gives you the best fit to what we call this blunderbuss pattern. Okay, so Joseph is going to say quite a lot more about this and other models of evolution in deep time. But what I'm trying to show here is you can, here we've sort of skated over the details of the quantitative genetic parameters, except to see underlying the model is what we're modeling is the timing of jumps in the peak of the adaptive landscape. All right, so just summing up, what have we learned? This is where we've been leading with all of the lectures so far today. The takeaway message is that we can model adaptive radiations in deep time with quantitative genetic models, and we're using the results that we can reasonably expect equilibration of genetic parameters like the G matrix to extrapolate through time. Models in which an adaptive peak is stationary don't really count for the scope of actual adaptive radiations. They do account for radiations of, or the differentiation in characters that are very, very conservative in their divergence. When we plot body size information on over a large range of timescales, as we did here, we see bounded evolution as a prominent mode of evolution, actually on all timescales. So notice that you can see that the population, the divergence data lies within these violet bounds. But if you look at this distribution out here, the preponderance of the data points are within those bounds too. What happens on long time scales is the bounded evolution becomes sloppy and populations spill out into large positive and negative divergences from the ancestral trait mean. So the departures that we see from bounded evolution are rare, you know, like the best fit is in one sense, one sudden departure in 25 million years, but that might represent an invasion of new adaptive zones resulting from some key ecological event that happens at widely spaced intervals, or you know, invasion of new adaptive zones, or the invasion of new competitors or prey that are accounting for these sudden jumps in the adaptive peak. And again, here's a list of references, and this talk is very much the short version of about 5 or 6 chapters in this book I've written. So you can see one of those chapters in the notes, but there are a lot more in the upcoming book. How can I be? I did my lecture in half an hour, didn't I? Of course, that leaves a lot of time for discussion. Let's look at it that way. Questions or comments?